Today we're going to begin talking about measuring behavior and what this means for us as behavior analysts. This will cover data collection, specifically frequency, duration data, many different types, and we'll get to discuss that in detail. We'll also have a chance to review videos and get a chance to practice ABC charts, as well as taking interval recording data. Before we get started with the lecture portion, go ahead and take the pre-module check-in. Before we start talking about measurement, we really need to understand what it is that we're measuring. Behavior is an observable and measurable event. It is not things like being hungry, being anxious, receiving something like money, or just feeling something or sensing something like the wind blowing. A couple examples of behavior are a child flops to the floor when asked to do his math homework. Another example might be a child becoming aggressive or a child completing their work. Some non-examples of behavior are Chance is feeling hungry and then decides to flop on the floor. I italicized some words there that are an example of non-behavioral language. You'll hear us talk about that more and more as we get into ABC charts, but basically what that means is that it's language that relates to an internal event or something that we simply can't measure. So feeling something or deciding something, thinking something, hearing something. As observers, we can't really know if somebody is doing any of those things unless they tell us. So in that case, the behavior would be for them to tell us that they're feeling or sensing those things. Otherwise, it's a non-behavioral term and we need to stay away from it. Take some time now to fill out in your packet the examples of behavioral and non-behavioral terms. Some more aspects of behavior that we need to be aware of are the qualities of it, such as repeatability, temporal extent, and temporal locus. Repeatability just means when behavior can be counted. Temporal extent is how long a behavior occurs. And then temporal locus is a point in time that behavior occurs. In order to have a complete understanding of behavior, you also need to understand what's not a behavior. Ogden Lindsley coined the term dead man's test in order to make this distinction. What this means is that if a dead man can do it, it probably isn't behavior. We'll go over specific examples of what this looks like. Take a look at these events and try to determine if these events are behaviors or not behaviors. Remember, the key is if a dead man can do it, then it's probably not a behavior. All of the behaviors that I highlighted in yellow pass the dead man's test. That means that they are all considered behaviors because a dead man can't do them. For example, swimming. I'm hoping that you've never seen a dead man swim. All of the events that I highlighted in blue are not classified as a behavior. Many of them do not pass the dead man's test, and others of them are simply not behavioral in definition. For example, not answering is something that a dead man could do. Being lazy is also a thing that a dead man could do. Being anxious is an example of a non-behavioral term. Now that we have a better grasp on what constitutes a behavior and not, I'd like to take a couple minutes to talk about how we measure it. Data collection serves such an important purpose, and it's exactly how we measure behavior. We want to make sure that as behavior analysts and RBTs, we're using evidence-based practice. One way we do this is by making sure behaviors that we are measuring are observable and measurable. ABA itself is an evidence-based applied science. This means that there's tons of research supporting its effectiveness, and it truly is based and rooted in science. So as we're practicing as RBTs, behavior that, we need to be considering if what we're doing is evidence-based. Data collection is a good way to measure a child's baseline or what the child does before we intervene. Progress can also be measured using data. You'll probably do this a lot in your position as an RBT. Another thing we consider is when a child has mastered a skill. This means that they've reached a point in their learning that they are able to do this skill at such a level that your supervisor feels it's ready to move on. Typically, you'll see a mastery criteria of 80% over a specific amount of days, but this might vary depending on your child. Your supervisor will use the data that you collect every day in your sessions in order to determine if the intervention we're using is successful or not. This could be related specifically to behaviors of concern, but it can also be related to skill acquisition. This is why it's so important that as RBTs, you have a good handle on data collection and how to take it accurately so that we make sure we are treating these children as effectively as we can. Oftentimes, when a child is exhibiting a behavior of concern, we'll want to take ABC data so that we can determine patterns of this behavior. ABC data collection is specifically trying to figure out environmental variables that relate to the behavior of concern. This helps us to treat the behavior most effectively. As an observer, you will need to take note of 3 specific variables in this data collection process. Antecedent is what the A stands for. This is the event that immediately precedes the behavior. Note that this is not something done by the client. This means that it does need to be something done by somebody else or by an environmental variable. Behavior. This is the event of interest. Typically, when you're taking ABC data, you would want to focus on the behavior of concern. However, sometimes it's necessary to determine when a child is exhibiting behaviors that we want to see so that we can tell when a behavior happens and when it doesn't happen and what environmental variables might contribute to this. The consequence. This is the event that immediately follows the behavior. Just like the antecedent, this cannot be something done by the client, but instead needs to be something that is in the environment or done by somebody else. After you take ABC data, it's necessary to determine patterns. We see the patterns in the antecedents and in the consequences. The information gathered from ABC data will be instrumental in helping us modify a behavior of concern of a child. Now it's time for you to practice taking ABC data. In your packet, you'll find a little spreadsheet that has antecedent column, behavior column, and consequence column. You'll use this while you're taking ABC data. The behavior that we're going to focus on in the video is titled refusing to do work. The definition for this is turning away from work, hitting the table, stomping his feet, and laying on the floor. Note that these are the only behaviors that we're going to be taking data on. Remember that you can always pause the video, go back, and rewatch if needed.
Working for? Awesome. Put in. All right, buddy, we're gonna work. We're gonna have a calm body. Show me nice hands. All right, back to our seat. Great job, friend. And timer.
Take a look at your sheet and mine and make a comparison. You'll notice that all antecedents in the antecedent column and all consequence in the consequences column are either done by somebody else or are an environmental variable. The child's behavior is nowhere found in either column. The child's behavior is only found in the behavior column. One pattern that's immediately evident to me is in the antecedent column, the client is pretty regularly being asked to do work or being redirected back to work. A common consequence is for him to be redirected back to work, staff presented, or to be given a new task. Note that his behavior took each form that was in the definition. This is good to note, but is not always the case. Sometimes behavior definitions are pretty extensive, but in your observation, you might only see one or maybe a couple of them. One thing you'll notice with ABC data is that the antecedent of one line might be the consequence of the preceding line. This is why they're called behavior chains, because they kind of link together. I find it useful to use shorthand when I'm taking ABC data, just because in the real world, there's not a pause button and things do go pretty quickly. Marks, initials, and other shorthand strategies will be useful for you to get the most accurate data. One common error with ABC data is the use of non-behavioral language. Some examples of this are the words feels, thinks, sees, hears, and didn't do a specific action. The reason these are non-behavioral in nature is because we can't observe them unless they're told to us by the client. Also, saying that a person feels a specific way is making an assumption, and that's something we want to stay away from in our field. Another thing to note is that if somebody does tell us that they feel a certain way or think something or see something, we need to note their behavior, which is them telling us that. The behavior in that case is not them feeling or thinking that, but that they said that they feel or think that. In the example video, you might have put he was angry, and you would have implied this because of him being aggressive by hitting things and stomping his feet. Instead of assuming that he feels a certain way, you need to make sure to focus on the behaviors that you're seeing. Next, I'd like for you to take a look at the antecedent and consequence columns that you wrote. Remember that you should have only included things happening in the environment or behaviors of other people, and not the behavior of the child. With regard to non-behavioral language, some adjustments you can make are: for feels, you could say that something was presented to the child. For example, if something soft is touching the child, you could say presentation of a stuffed animal. In retrospect, you might have put feels something soft. But remember, this is not behavioral language. If you wanted to say that the child felt mad because another student did or said something, you would omit the feeling and just say what the other student said or did. Instead of saying that the child sees something, you would say that something is visible. For example, if there's a movie in the room, then you would say the movie was visible or the movie was present. You don't want to assume that the child can see the video even if they're looking at it. If you want to say that the child hears something, instead you can say that music was playing in the room, or whatever it is that you might think the child might hear. Again, you don't want to make the assumption that the student is listening to it or hears it. Another adjustment is to indicate a behavior that doesn't pass the dead man's test. Instead, you want to say specifically what the child is doing rather than what they're not doing. For example, if in the antecedent column they were told to stand up and the child didn't stand up, Instead, you would want to say that they continued sitting in their chair rather than didn't stand, because not standing does not pass the dead man's test.